So today we'll be discussing voting restrictions being put in place by the Texas Legislature, election bills, and what it means for Texas voters. But before we begin, I want to thank Lone Star College, Texas State Technical College, League of Women Voters, and Secure Democracy for supporting this episode. And now on to our guest. Today I'm joined by Alexa Ura. Alexa is an associate editor and the demographics reporter for the Tribune. And Alexa actually joined us earlier for a different episode, so feel free to go check her out. In our first episode, we talked about redistricting. But here at the Tribune, she covers the intersection between politics and race with an emphasis on the state's surging Hispanic population. She also covers voting rights issues and won an Investigative Reporters and Editors Award last year for her reporting on a botched review of the voter rolls. If you have any questions for Alexa, feel free to use the little comment section at the bottom of your screen. And with that being said, let's get started. So thank you so much for joining me. Voting is a big deal right now. It's a big topic of discussion in the session. So can you explain the differences between the proposals to change voting in Texas in the State House and the State Senate?
Sure. So there have been a wide range of proposals filed in both chambers, things that touch the voting registration process, to how voting is conducted, even to the live streaming of vote counting. But the two main bills that have emerged as priorities for Republicans are House Bill 6 in the House and Senate Bill 7. Of those two, Senate Bill 7 is much more broad. It touches a lot more of the voting process and would put in place many more restrictions that aren't there now. It limits things like extended early voting hours, it bans drive-through voting, it regulates where polling places, the distribution of polling places in the big urban counties. And so it's much more broad in that way. House Bill 6, one of the main things it does is that it makes it a crime for election officials to send out applications to vote by mail for people who didn't request them. Senate Bill 7 also prohibits that, but doesn't criminalize it to the same extent. It creates new requirements for people who are helping voters fill out their ballots to have to disclose the reason why they're helping that voter, which in many cases can be for medical reasons that you wouldn't have to otherwise disclose. And it does things like enhance poll watcher freedom. That's something that is in both of the bills. And, in a state where there has been a long history of intimidation of voters of color in particular, that has raised big concerns for voting rights advocates. The Senate bill would even let poll watchers record voters who are getting assistance if they think that the assistance is unlawful. So there's overlap, but there are pretty big differences. And Senate Bill 7 of the two is the one that comes with many more restrictions, at least relative to HB 6.
So what triggered these changes or proposals? Why is the legislator looking at this now?
A lot of these bills are obviously coming after the 2020 election, during which we saw increased turnout across the board, but during which we also saw Republicans raising the sort of unfounded concerns about widespread voter fraud. Obviously, there were many legal fights to even try to overturn the results of the election. All of those efforts have failed. And so, that's the context in which a lot of these voting restrictions are being proposed. What you'll hear from Republicans is that they want to restore trust in the voting process. Obviously, some of the doubts about the voting process have emerged as they themselves have contested either the results or raised claims of widespread voter fraud for which there's really not a whole lot of evidence, if any. And so that's the context that this is happening here, and that in which it's happening across the country as well.
So you mentioned the reasons why Republicans want to, make these changes. So what has been the response to this? You briefly mentioned it when we were talking about like the different proposals in the Senate and the House, but what has been the overall response, or just the response to the possible changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've heard really from a collection of folks, we've heard voting rights advocates, we've heard this from advocates for voters with disabilities, we've heard it from a couple of big corporate giants based in Texas, but even from community leaders and faith leaders that to them, these proposals are sort of the latest in a long line of efforts in Texas to create more restrictions for voting, and that these cannot be sort of separated from that long line of restrictions that we've seen in the past, and restrictions that have regularly been found in court to harm voters of color at a time when voters of color are becoming a bigger part of the electorate and helping Democrats kind of drive up their margins, especially in some of those urban areas.
So you mentioned voters of color. Who would be most affected? I mean, you also mentioned voters with disabilities. So are there any other groups who are also saying that they might be heavily impacted by this?
You know, I think anytime you set a restriction, obviously it can impact voters from different backgrounds. And there are different sort of groups you can put voters in, right? When you can think about race, you can think about socioeconomic status, like who has a car to go drive to a polling place and go to another one if that polling place the line is too long there. But one of the main concerns with these bills, you know, at least on the front with voters with disabilities, is that it doesn't make it easier for them to vote, right? They face a system, particularly in the last year, that isn't completely accessible to them, even if it's more accessible than in other states. And this not only doesn't make that easier, but could harm that by creating these new forms for the people that are helping them, by giving poll watchers the ability to record them, and the fears about the effect that would have on people being willing to assist them if they could be prosecuted if someone thinks that they're doing something unlawful. And, you know, I think with voters of color, there are provisions in SB 7 in particular, the ones that would target drive-through voting, which Harris County did in 2020, that would outlaw 24-hour voting, which Harris County already did. The county has told us, and there have been other analysis by other voting rights groups, that those voting methods were used disproportionately by voters of color. And so taking those away could harm them. And when you look at the regulation on the distribution of polling places, the formula that the bill sets up is based on registered voters in each state house district in the county, and that would, you know, very likely lead to a drop in polling places in state house districts held by Democrats, which are more likely to have more voters of color in those districts as well.
So you mentioned the 24-hour just early voting and polling places, and I know that you recently wrote about two contrasting election nights, one where there was like a line and just there wasn't a lot of access to early voting, and then another where there were 24-hour voting. So can you describe a little bit about why this happened in Harris County and why they decided to have these 24-hour polls?
Yeah. Places? You know, the story we wrote about was from the March 2020 primary, during which you had this combination of issues with the county not setting enough polling machines at a polling place at a historically Black university. And it was born out of sort of fighting between Republicans and Democrats in the county, but also the county falling short for voters there. And you had voters who waited up to 7 hours to cast their ballots in that election on that day. And after that, we didn't really hear an outcry from lawmakers about that being something that shouldn't happen again. And then if you flash forward about 8 months into the November general, you had people again voting after midnight, but this time it was voluntary, right? It was because of this effort by Harris County to host basically 24-hour voting. It was hoping to target people like dock workers and shift workers, doctors, some students for whom voting from 7 to 7 just really didn't work. And, you know, they were hoping to bring it back for future elections based on what they saw saw in 2020. It was driven out of the pandemic. It was also driven out of the hope to reach voters who normally aren't able to vote during those hours. And under SB 7 and a few other proposals that haven't been deemed priorities, but still would regulate this, that would go away for future elections.
So Texas is still in Republican control, but Democrats have made some gains in the recent years. Can you speak to how, you briefly mentioned this, but can you elaborate a little bit more about how demographic shifts might have influence on these efforts just to have more restrictive voting laws?
Yeah, I mean, over the last few elections, what we've seen is a narrowing of the Republican margin of victory, both statewide and especially in these urban areas and even in some of these suburban areas around them. And a lot of that, in part, is because of an increase of voters of color in the electorate. You have the people who are turning 18 every day are far more likely to be people of color than they are to be white voters. You have these urban cores that are growing much faster than other parts of the state. And you have some of that growth also happening in suburban communities that are diversifying in ways they weren't before. And as those shifts have happened, we've seen even Democrats win some of these seats in suburban areas that were drawn to really be held by Republicans based on sort of the math that was drawn. And so over these last elections, you've seen this change. And you've seen this change in part because more voters of color are entering the electorate. And I think as we've been covering these restrictions, you have to look at them against the context of the state. And that is it's a state that has passed laws that have hurt voters of color disproportionately, as many courts have found, and it's a state where the electorate is shifting and changing very rapidly in a way that moves it away from kind of this stronghold Republican state.
So we talked a little bit about your previous reporting, but we also have previously reported that Texas has already some of the strictest voting laws in the country, even before these proposals. Can you explain why that is? And again, you already mentioned this before, but can you elaborate a little bit more about why we have such strict laws already?
Yeah, I mean, so, Texas lawmakers who have been in charge of the state for the last quarter century have resisted efforts to change the rules in ways that people generally agree help with access. So in Texas, we don't have online voter registration, whereas other states have automatic voter registration where as soon as you turn 18 and you're determined to be eligible, you get added to the rolls. Other states have same-day registration where you can vote on election day. In Texas, you have to register at least 30 days out from the election. We have things like the voter ID law, which has been rewritten because it was initially too strict and disproportionately harmed voters of color, but it's still a pretty strict law that, if you go vote and you have to show ID, the state will take your concealed handgun permit, but not your student ID, right? And so it's a combination of these things that have happened over time that usually leads Texas to sort of be labeled in that way.
So large companies have actually spoken against the proposed restrictions that are currently being considered. Can you talk a little bit about the significance of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly in the aftermath of the protests we saw after the death of George Floyd, you really saw corporations speaking about racial injustice and sort of a willingness to speak up against it. And I think when you talk about voting, there are obviously clear concerns about voters of color and how new restrictions affect them. And so when these bills sort of started moving in Georgia, that's where it really came to a head, where corporations kind of sat out the legislative process and didn't really come out against any of those bills until after the fact. And so then you see this fight move over to Texas as the legislative session gets going. And we've had a couple of corporations come out specifically against some bills. There have been other businesses that have come out kind of generally against voting restrictions, but American Airlines and Dell, both based in Texas, have come out against Senate Bill 7 and HB 6 respectively. And, I think following the bathroom bill fight from a few sessions ago, where the business community really came out forcefully and it helped in part defeat that bill, there is an expectation about what this involvement could mean for these voting restrictions. I think a key difference, though, is that back then we had, Governor Greg Abbott at the beginning hadn't really made clear whether he supported the bathroom bill. Like, that came months later. In this case, he's made pretty clear that he not only supports some of these proposals, but also took issue with some of the businesses that are speaking out against them in Georgia and in Texas as well. So the dynamics are a little bit different there.
So I guess ultimately, how likely are these proposals to pass, especially since Governor Greg Abbott has voiced the support for them?
Obviously the legislature is controlled by Republicans. So I don't think there is a question about whether the votes are there in either chamber for these bills to get out of both chambers and get to the governor's desk. I think the question is which ones end up getting there. Do lawmakers endorse something that's broad like SB 7? Do they move HB 6? Obviously, leadership in each chamber has kind of their own priorities with their own bill. There are still a few weeks left in session. Senate Bill 7 has been voted out of the Senate, but hasn't been taken up in the House. And House Bill 6 it's been voted out of committee, but hasn't taken up in the House. So I think we're still in the wait and see process. Or point of this process. But, at the end of the day, Republicans have the votes to pass some type of new voting rules and or restrictions. And the governor, like you said, has said very clearly that he supports some of them.
So for anyone watching today, how can they get involved in this process? How can they make their voices heard if they have any kind of opinion or anything to say about these proposals?
The biggest part, obviously the maybe most prominent entryway into the process for folks is often the committee process, where you can publicly testify in person or submit testimony in writing. You can do that obviously with any number of bills, but that often is sort of the main entry point for a lot of folks. I think in the House you can submit some of that writing online, and you can also go to the Capitol and register your position if you don't feel comfortable sitting in a room with other folks during a pandemic. You can at least go in and register your position against or for a bill, and it'll still be recorded.
Awesome. Well, I think with that, we're out of time, but I want to thank everybody who joined us today for tuning in. And I want to thank you, Alexa, for joining us today and explaining what's going on in the legislature. And for more of our coverage, get the latest and just everything that's going on, Alexa's reporting at texastribune.org. And I want to thank everyone again, and we'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Thank you.